I was optimistic that Firewall Ultra could be the long-awaited MacGuffin in the fancy new PlayStation VR 2's come-up story. The original, Firewall 0 Hour, entered the scene with bombast in 2018, making the most of far less impressive tech. So it makes sense that eye tracking, sense controllers, and foveated rendering might add new layers of depth to multiplayer VR shooting. But while Firewall Ultra does make great use of a few of the PSVR 2's features, especially the OLED display and 3D audio spatialization, it's not nearly as revolutionary as I'd hoped. Thanks to molasses-thick progression that is punishing far more often than rewarding, clunky controls that feel straight up unnatural thanks to an over-reliance on eye tracking, and an overall lack of content, Firewall Ultra is ultimately only a competent sequel at best. Despite it being a competitive, multiplayer first-person shooter like Firewall 0 Hour, the first enemy I grappled with after booting up Firewall Ultra was its nauseating menu. This menu interface is based entirely on eye tracking, with seemingly no way to turn that feature off in favor of much simpler pointing and clicking. I have a relatively strong stomach for VR. I have played hundreds of hours of VR games like Pavlov and other first-person shooters, but this was unusually uncomfortable for me to navigate for at least the first couple of hours. This sucks because it's here where basically everything important but the shooting happens, from setting up your character to joining a match.
Welcome to the Gauntlet.
At least Ultra's confusing menu is not the very first thing you see. Instead, you're shuffled through a comprehensive and helpful tutorial zone. It's full of shooting ranges and drills that do a decent job of getting you used to the controls. But don't be fooled. No matter how many times you run drills against its peculiarly crafted dummies, there's no Captain Price to ferry you to the next mission. When you're ready to leave, you'll want to open up your menu, select an option, and what the heck is going on? Firewall Ultra doesn't do a ton of onboarding. This is partially because there is no dedicated campaign, just a bunch of menus and a hub area that it plops you directly into between rounds. It's serviceable, but disappointingly bare bones. At least this main hub room where you queue up lets you change your loadouts at the weapon bench. You can also set up your squad or even jump into a different match through Firewall's clunky in-game menu. But it's not even that approachable, thanks to specific options being locked behind computers that are scattered around the hub area. These include the weapon vendors that let you eventually purchase new weapons and gear as you unlock them, but they also include options that are grayed out. Ultimately, it's just far more confusing to get your bearings than it should be. That said, there is some meat on Firewall Ultra's multiplayer-centric bones. The Contracts mode returns as Ultra's bread-and-butter game mode, as well as its only PvP option. It sets 2 teams of 4 players against one another in a game of cat and mouse, where one team defends an access point while the other team tries to get through those defenses. The spoils go to whoever wins 2 out of 3 rounds, and each team gets at least one chance to play as the attacker and the defender. The Contracts mode is well crafted, with each teammate able to customize their loadout with different skills, characters, guns, equipment, and so forth. Unfortunately, I stuck to the predetermined loadouts thanks to an arcane progression system that is downright sluggish, where rewards are gated both by a slow earned currency and an experience bar that takes forever to move. Ultra's post-launch edition of assignments is promising, but in its current form, it's basically just a tacked-on mission system where you get a little bit of extra XP after earning a certain number of kills with specific weapons, once per day at that. It's still needlessly difficult to level up if you aren't constantly getting 5 or 6 kills in a single match. In such a team-focused multiplayer shooter, it's perplexing that Firewall Ultra went so far out of its way to keep me at lower levels, even when I spent most of a match reviving my downed teammates, spotting enemies on the security cameras, or using tactical gear like door blockers and flashbang grenades. Since most of the Bible weapons and items only open up at later levels, progression almost feels locked away for Firewall Ultra's most elite players, or whoever is willing to pay for the privilege by speeding things up with real money microtransactions. Those haven't been fully rolled out yet, aside from a few viable characters. One of them already comes with a suspiciously overpowered perk, but it remains to be seen just how deep Ultra's microtransactions will ultimately go. At least this time around, there's also a PvE mode, Exfil, which sends 4 players to capture 3 different points on a map while waves of competently AI-controlled enemies spawn in from all sides. These matches don't offer much of an XP or currency reward either, but they can be a great way to get used to Ultra's controls and maps. Speaking of maps, my favorite part of Firewall Ultra is its small but diverse collection of 8 different locations, each delicately crafted to feel dynamic. For instance, the Crossroads map sets the control point inside of a house that's accessible from 4 or 5 different entrances, forcing the defending team to hunker down and take their chances on which areas to seal up and defend. Meanwhile, the attacking team needs to find creative ways to break the defending team's guard. Playing defense required my team to work together to play a game of whack-a-mole against an opponent that was doing everything in its power to make us second-guess our positioning. Whereas, playing offense on the same map required the use of guerrilla tactics, like making myself a decoy by providing cover fire from a remote location. Meanwhile, the rest of my team scurried between cover, resulting in one of the most intense VR shootouts I've experienced recently. Each map is designed to force both teams to play in asymmetric ways, rewarding strategic interplay where teammates help one another adapt to enemy tactics through spoken communication over voice chat, rather than rewarding one squad mate jumping into the fray with a shotgun like Rambo. Doing that is usually an excellent way to lose a match early. Maps like Social and Oil Rig cleverly use darkness, which appears pitch black in the PSVR 2's OLED display and can be exploited by a skilled player to move across a room or a corridor undetected. Likewise, most guns have flashlights that can counter a stealthy enemy player and even blind them, unless they close their real-life eyes. But the coolest of Firewall Ultra's additions is that dead teammates now take control of the map's security cameras, giving them the ability to mark enemy players and call them out to surviving squad mates via comms. This mechanic keeps things fresh since communication is key to survival, and it's exhilarating to outmaneuver and outstrategize the opposing team when everyone is working together. These skirmishes are tense and tactical, making exceptional use of the PlayStation VR 2's OLED display, Pulse 3D audio, and controller haptics. Ultra's janky character models are the weakest part of its presentation, but its environments and weapons are intricately designed. Weapons feel satisfyingly hefty, providing a ton of force feedback in my Sense controllers, as well as believable on-screen muzzle flashes and excellent sound design.
Yep, I'm coming with you, actually.
On the same note, Firewall Ultra probably features the best use of 3D spatialization in any VR game I've ever played. Not only do my weapons sound lifelike, rooting me in Firewall's world, but nearby footsteps and gunshots also sound like they're positioned exactly where they look like they're coming from. At one point, I thought one of my teammates closing a door I just walked through was someone coming into my actual room. I'm less happy about Firewall Ultra's control scheme, which feels like several steps backward. There's no manual reloading, and instead of having weapons holstered on your avatar's body, you now need to hold a button on your primary controller while you select the weapon you want with your eyes. Thanks to this system, switching weapons mid-combat isn't just slow and unnatural, it's also nauseating. Firewall Ultra does make aiming slightly easier in 2 key ways, but even then they're both still experimental and clunky in practice. First, pressing L2 now toggles ADS, but it doesn't really work in VR. Wherever my head is pointing, my gun simulates lining itself up as though I were looking down the sights, but it's not exactly locked to a position that gives me the most control or even the most accuracy, with the gun jammed uncomfortably close to my face. Second, grenades rely entirely on eye tracking, showing you your grenade's trajectory before you lob it. This makes it easier to visualize where a grenade's gonna land, but it's a poor simulation of hand-eye coordination since you don't actually throw grenades as you do in other VR shooters. You simply press a button and your avatar does it for you, which feels unnatural compared to other VR shooters. Firewall Ultra simultaneously feels like 2 steps forward and 2 steps backward. It somehow does just as much right and wrong as Firewall Zero Hour, a VR game that is now over 5 years old. While its shooting and tactical teamwork feel, look, and sound better than ever, its content is limited and it's filled with questionable uses of new tech like eye tracking. What it all adds up to is a decent competitive multiplayer shooter that just happens to be in VR, but its awkward controls are a shot in the foot rather than the shot in the arm that the PlayStation VR 2 desperately needed.